Oh, hello and welcome to this session on the creative and cultural economy of Sri Lanka. We at the British Council, I'm Jill Caldicott, I'm the Director of the British Council, launched our research report. You can see it up there on the screen, Creative and Cultural Industries in Sri Lanka, on Saturday, the 2nd of May. And subsequently, we've had numerous requests for a video of the session to be made available to everybody. Due to some technical difficulties on the day, we didn't capture all of what happened on Saturday. And so we have put this video together especially for those who have requested it. And it will be available in the online environment on our website for you to look at any time. So what's it going to consist of? First of all, I'm going to give a short presentation based on the report. It will summarize some of the main findings of the report and how the report, how the research took place. But that, of course, will not replace looking and having access to the whole report, which is very rich and in depth in many ways. And if you would like to do that, please access the report on our website, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. After that, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, John Newbigin. And John kindly put together a video version of what he did on Saturday, which we're able to show you. And then we have about an hour of what actually happened on Saturday in terms of the panel, questions and answers, panel discussions, and some very interesting feedback coming in from the audience. Okay, so let me share with you now. So that's the agenda, and you can see on the right-hand side just some of the people who have contributed to this, which includes Dilanie from IPS, which is the Institute of Policy Studies, who conducted the research on our behalf. Annemarie de Silva, who is a researcher and a writer, and who put all the research together for us and made it coherent and produced the report. Our keynote speaker, John Newbigin. A very interesting panel with Selyna Pieris, Linda Speldewind, Anushka Wijesinha, and then some concluding remarks and suggestions on the way forward. Okay, so I'm just going to give a quick introduction, as I said, to the report, and just to emphasize that it really is just a baseline study of the current state of the cultural and creative industries of Sri Lanka. And as far as we know, nothing of this nature had been done before, covering as many of the sectors as we felt were interesting and relevant and really contributing at this point in time. It's a very first attempt to create a framework, to develop understanding, to see what the challenges are in a world where the creative sector, without any doubt, is growing in global significance. And one of the first challenges we had, of course, was to say, well, you know, what's included and what isn't included in this research. And in order to do that, we had to settle on a sort of definition of the creative and cultural industries. And the one you can see on the screen right now is the one that's been used in the UK and was set out by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport some years ago in 1998. So that is that the cultural and creative industries are those activities which have their origin in individual creativity, skill and talent, and which have a potential for wealth and job creation through the generation and exploitation of intellectual property. And you'll see that that word intellectual property comes up again and again, and it's absolutely key to, I think, taking this sector forward successfully. Okay, so what does the report cover? Well, yeah, as I said, you know, we looked at, and IPS looked at many definitions and many lists of what's included in a creative and cultural sector for a country. We looked at the UK, we looked at countries in Europe, and we looked at countries in Asia, in South Asia particularly, and we felt that the Singapore model was more or less the nearest to what was relevant to Sri Lanka. And so we basically used that and built on it a little bit. So 3 main areas: arts and culture, design and media, and subsectors within that on photography, visual arts, performing arts, heritage and craft. In design, software, advertising, branding, architecture, interior design, graphic design, industrial and fashion design. And under media, publishing, television and radio, digital, film and video. Because of the debate on what should be in and what shouldn't be in, there was also some research done on Ayurveda, on beauty culture and on the culinary arts. In the end, we felt these weren't quite central to what was happening in the creative sector in Sri Lanka, but we included a summary of the research in the report in an appendix, so you can see where those sectors are as well. Well, the approach and methodology that was taken by IPS, multiple types of approaches, research methods, including, and these are important, I think, the analysis of recent labour force survey. So we have a strong sense of, you know, sort of who is employed in these sectors and in what proportions. There was also a survey of nearly 500 creative people across Sri Lanka in 7 of the 9 provinces. And there were 8 focus groups with 75 participants and 40 key informant interviews. And all of this work was strongly supported by a steering committee of around a dozen people from the creative industry, representatives, a mixture of local Sri Lankan and other experts, overseas experts, including from the UK. So one of the key questions that we really wanted to answer, and was very challenging in fact, was what is the worth of this sector to the Sri Lankan economy? What percentage does it contribute to GDP? And there aren't a lot of statistics around, so we had to go back to some reports that were written in 2010 and then in 2014, and we can see by looking at those two that there was a considerable increase in that period of time, both in terms of the actual value to GDP, but also in terms of a growth in percentage. So over those years between 2010 and 2014, there was a 95% growth, calculated purely on the exports of goods and services, because that was the data that was available. So of course, if we were to have statistics for 2019, 2020, when we were doing the research, then we would expect a greater contribution and an increased percentage contribution as well. Now, a little bit of a negative around that is that the statistics that were looked at showed that during that period, 2010 to 2014, there were also consistently higher imports of creative goods and services. And they were higher than what Sri Lanka was exporting. So for this particular sector, there was at that time a negative balance of trade. A great pity, because Sri Lanka has so much to offer and to offer the world. And obviously it's to it's to our advantage if we can reverse that balance of payments, balance of trade. So, you know, just looking conservatively, we can see that the GDP contribution in 2014, which is the last time we've got a reliable statistic, was 1.06% of a contribution to the economy, calculating from creative goods and services that were exported. And of course, if we knew, or if we were able to value the in-country trade in creativity, in creative goods and services, that would be much higher. So what about employment in the sector? Well, from the research, it became evident that nearly 3% of the workforce in Sri Lanka is involved in the creative sector, in the creative industries. And that's higher, in fact, I believe, than in tourism. Tourism gets a lot of focus. It's said to be, you know, a huge hope for the growth of the economy in Sri Lanka. And yet, in reality, there are more people working in the creative sector. It's well known, of course, that creative industries are closely linked and can help to boost tourism and the visitor economy in general. What else do we know? We know that 36% of employees in the sector are women, and that 67% are between the ages of 24 and 55. The overwhelming majority, and this is very interesting, are in the private sector, which means that they are generating wealth. They're creating public earning through taxation. We found that the awareness in the sector of intellectual property rights is very poor in general among the employees, and so, as many as self-employed as well, then this was particularly relevant. So at only 8.8% of the sector having any form of IP protection. Another interesting fact is that the sector employs all educational range, from all the educational range in Sri Lanka, from the highly educated to some contributors who are less well educated. A very good spread across the Sri Lankan demographic, in fact. And you can see there something around wages and earnings, and the mean average wage in the creative sector, the mean wage of the creative sector is actually below the national mean. But that's probably because in Sri Lanka, there is a very, very high number of people who are working in crafts, for example, one of the lower paid sectors. And if you take out the lower paid sectors, which are craft, which are product, graphic, and also we found fashion design, although subsequently we've had some colleagues and stakeholders who've challenged that. But if you take those sectors out, then we find that on average, the earning is slightly above, or in fact, you know, quite comfortably above the national mean. And then, of course, if you look at IT, design, advertising, which have a much younger demographic, then the earning potential is actually much higher. And it attracts the young and the ambitious, probably because of that earning potential and because of the prestige of operating and living and earning in urban companies as opposed to rural. A very significant findings that came up was that the craft making is clearly decreasing in terms of uptake among younger generations. We suppose that this is to do with the poorer working conditions and the lower wages, but it's a sad fact, and it has, of course, some implications for the future of craft in this country, unless we're able to rectify that situation. A substantial part of the report looks at each of those sectors that we visited earlier on and gives us a small analysis of each sector, so subsector analysis with you know, sort of challenges and some recommendations for each of them. And we don't have time here to look at that in detail, but what I did is that I pulled out what I felt were a few highlights for Sri Lanka. And that includes the fact that Sri Lanka has amazing potential to be a very interesting, very viable and cost-effective, of course, film location for international productions. And of course, there have been some examples of how that is already working, but much more potential there than is actually being realized at the moment. We also discovered that there's just a lot of literature flourishing online in all 3 languages. And there are these forums that are packed with poetry, short stories, serialized novels. So there's all this creativity coming through in the online environment, which is fabulous. We know that Sri Lanka's craft sector is culturally very important and in many ways contributes to the brand of the country as a whole. And while it's not very well developed commercially, with some few exceptions, at the moment, we feel that it actually has quite a lot of potential, immense potential for the future. And this was a new one for me and quite delightful to discover that, in fact, Sri Lanka tends to attract graduates from around the world because of its reputation for residential architecture. And so you find graduates coming here for post-study immersive apprenticeships. And that was a delightful discovery. There are, of course, a huge number of challenges. You know, we have to be very careful not to just think about the challenges, but how we can address them, how we can turn them around. I chose 3 challenges that came out of the report that really struck me. And I chose them, although they're linked to particular sectors, I felt that they had resonance across the whole of the industry. So the first one is this sense that actually working in the creative sector doesn't really constitute very viable employment for most young people. And very often parents and teachers actively discourage young people from going into this sector. Secondly, this whole issue of IP. And there is clearly, people were reporting a lot of plagiarism and IP theft. In fact, just lack of awareness of the respect that should be given to intellectual property. Photographers' work was an example, but right across the sector. And in fact, that IP laws at the current time are really not governing this sector or not supporting the sector in the way that it should. Craftspeople, as you may suppose, are very vulnerable in many ways. And at this particular time, of course, of immense difficulty, there are going to be many fluctuations in raw materials, in the supply, in the demand for craft goods, in the costs of the resources that are needed. There are market fluctuations that really affect craft product pricing. And more than anything else, craftspeople are struggling to find access to good markets. So those are just some of the challenges and 3 key ones, I think, that have resonance across the sector. Okay, I'm sort of shortcutting now really just to tell you what we felt were the 6 key recommendations. There are many in there related to each sector, but these are cross-sectoral recommendations. And if we can realise these, then we feel that the creative and cultural industries of Sri Lanka have considerable potential. First of all, there is a recommendation around actually positioning Sri Lanka as an ethical and sustainable creative hub. A number of the sectors are already working in this way and are practicing ethical and sustainable ways of operating, and that is a delight, and it's clearly something that Sri Lanka can leverage as a unique selling point for the sector. Secondly, Sri Lanka needs support. Each of its creative industries needs support in the position that it can hold in the global value chain. And we have Annemarie de Silva talking about that a little bit later in this video. It was a struggle to find good data, and collecting data on the cultural and creative industries going forward is one of our recommendations. And by doing so, it will help us all, I think, to make the valid argument of its importance to the social and creative, the social and the economic economies of Sri Lanka. Fourthly, we strongly endorse the idea of having a strong professional association of cultural and creative industries. There's a lot of smaller operations who are working independently, competitively, and competition, of course, is important, but so is collaboration. And we feel that if you can come together, work together to raise the profile and basically support each other, then we can make a very, very strong argument for the viability of the creative economy of Sri Lanka. Addressing this issue of intellectual property right is going to be key. You saw in the DCMS definition that actually intellectual property is at the heart of what a creative person does, what they produce. And if that's not respected, then you're taking away their rights. You're taking away their right to a living, their right to the ownership of what they have produced. That is going to be key to success for the future. And finally, and this is a very much bigger question, and it links to how we work across to education as well, is that creative education needs to be strengthened. And the teaching of creativity and the creative arts needs to be much more prominent in the curriculum, and going further than that, the valuing of creativity as a career and in society as a whole. Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to stop there, but before I go, I would like to introduce to you John Newbigin, our keynote speaker. He is an OBE. He is ambassador for the creative industries at Mayor of London, so representing the creative sector in London. He was founder and first chairman of Creative England, and he's a very good friend of the British Council. In fact, he is the chair of the British Council's advisory group for arts and creative economy. And I'm now going to hand over to John, and we're going to show you the video that he kindly prepared for us of his keynote speech.
Hello. Great pleasure to be able to join you for the launch of this Creative and Cultural Industries in Sri Lanka report, which I think is a really excellent report. But we're meeting in strange times, aren't we? And here I'm in the UK rather than in Sri Lanka. And we're doing things online because of the pandemic, but of course it's worth bearing in mind that behind this health crisis there's the much bigger climate change crisis coming, and doing business like this is going to become part of the new normal, whatever happens. So it provides a useful context to be thinking about the future of the creative industries. I want to start by a quote from a great Hollywood screenwriter called William Goldman, who said of the film industry, "This is a know-nothing business." And what he meant by that was that you can have the best script in the world, you can have the best actors in Hollywood, you can throw money at the movie production, but you don't know if it's going to be a success until you've got an audience sitting in front of it. So it's a know-nothing business. And we are living in an absolutely know-nothing time. Not just about, we know nothing about the future of the economy, but we know nothing about the future of global societies in a way. Of course, some kind of normality will return, but it's not a foregone conclusion. So let me start by saying, what did the creative industries look like 8 weeks ago before all this started? Of course, what we know is that it's one of the fastest growing sectors in the world, and the United Nations frequently makes the point that this is true in every region of the world. It's not just something that's happening in North America and Western Europe. In fact, South-South trade is growing faster in cultural goods and services than any other part of the planet. So it's a growing and worldwide phenomenon. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is, as people's incomes rise around the world and more people have access to spare resources and better education, they're able to enjoy more creative and cultural goods and services. So the market is increasing. I'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, one of the features of this is that the value of manufacturing is in decline. Ideas are becoming more valuable than products. Intellectual property is becoming more significant than physical property. And it's epitomized by a mantra that the Chinese government had for their 11th five-year plan, which was, we've got to move from made in China to designed in China, because they understood that where the real value lies in the value chain is not in making something, but in the idea that lies behind it, the design, the marketing, and so on. So that's a big change for businesses, for economies, for governments, and most of all for bankers and investors to think about. And then a third issue is that the rise of robotics, of machine learning, artificial intelligence, the fourth industrial revolution, call it whatever you like, is really changing the way the global labor market works much more quickly than I think many of us acknowledge. And one of the aspects of that, well attested by research, is that the more creative a job is, the less likely it is to be replaced by a machine, obviously, because creative jobs depend on emotional intelligence, social sensitivity, all these qualities that we have as humans, which for the foreseeable future anyway, machines are unlikely to have. And so in thinking about the future of economies, this is an area which in a sense is future-proof, and it's very important for governments to be thinking about where are we going to be generating jobs for our children and our grandchildren. And then finally, it's undeniably the fact that culture and creativity are becoming more important qualities in distinguishing what goes on in different societies. So there are about 100 cities around the world now that like to call themselves creative cities. And if you think that in Abu Dhabi, the government has invested something like $15 billion in a huge cultural quarter on Saadiyat Island. And in Hong Kong government's done the same thing in West Kowloon. So culture, creativity, these things are becoming important in distinguishing one society from another. I want to come back to that too. So that's how the world was 8 weeks ago. Where is it now? Well, of course, one of the huge impacts is the catastrophic cessation of international travel and international tourism, which of course is affecting your economy very, very seriously. And related to that, one of the things this is showing up is the fragility of so much of the world's economy, particularly people working in the informal sector, self-employed, freelancers. And as your report highlights, there are many people working, particularly in the craft sector, who fall into those categories. what's happening to them? How are they going to acquire the skills and resilience to be able not just to survive the present lockdown, but to rethink how they access markets in a world where it may be a long time before international trade and travel really gets back to normal. Some airlines are saying it'll be 3 years before they think they get back to business as it was, if they ever get back to business as it was. But then, of course, on the other hand, the online world is booming. Here we are doing a webinar online. And companies that are thinking about how they move online, how they minimize physical travel, are going to be winners. And then a final point, which I think is of great relevance and which you flag up in your report, and that is that in this new climate where there's so much anxiety and fear about what's happening in the world, to have a reputation, as you set out in your report, for ethically and environmentally responsible manufacturing businesses, to be reliable, to be honest, to be candid, to be transparent. These things are going to be more important than they've ever been before, particularly when we're in a world where there is so much fake news and there's the rise of autocratic governments that are spinning any kind of nonsense as if it was the truth. For citizens, consumers, companies, to be knowing that they're doing business with people who are honest, reliable, maintain standards is going to be incredibly important. And you've got a big tick in the box, if I can put it like that, in that instance. So where does that leave Sri Lanka now? I mean, let me just keep focusing on that for a minute. I think this idea of your company, the island of innovation, is enormously important. This idea that the Sri Lankan economy is typified by businesses that are clever, smart, responsive, flexible, agile, and that's particularly true in the garment industry. Come back to that in a moment. These are incredibly important qualities. Of course, that doesn't deny that you've got a massive problem. We all have a massive problem because of what's happened with the slowdown in international travel and trade. So here's an opportunity to be rethinking how you rebuild that economy. And one of the things that I'd like to suggest is that, although, again, you flag up in the report that international trade, exports, are not as significant a part of the creative and cultural sector as you would like them to be and as they should be. Nevertheless, in this time when international trade and travel is so restricted, this is a moment to be thinking about how you build a more resilient and successful domestic market, because that enables testing propositions of what the world is going to be like when this comes to an end. And I say that because it seems to me, particularly in your situation in Sri Lanka, there you are suspended, if you like, between two huge and powerful neighbors, India and China. Both of them, as I was mentioning a moment ago, have got rapidly rising professional middle classes. That means that in both those countries, the market for creative and cultural goods and services is going to go on growing. But to access that market is going to require very good market intelligence, responsiveness, flexibility, an ability to listen to what customers really want. And it's also going to, and collaborations. I want to come back to that as well. The idea of being able to collaborate with partners, not necessarily obvious partners, partners across different sectors, in different regions, in different industries, to help you build those markets. Those are all challenges that you've got in the immediate future. And one of the things that interests me in your report is, although you have a lot to say about what you think the government should be doing to support the creative and cultural sector, I'd like to focus a little bit on what you should be doing yourselves, and to emphasize these 2 points that I've just been making. How do you build on that reputation for not just ethical and environmental responsibility, but for responsiveness, agility, I want to say humility, but not quite humility, but really being able to listen to what consumers and customers want, whether they're businesses or individuals. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because I think that's one of the distinguishing features of a successful creative sector. And then my other point is, how can you think about building your domestic market? To focus on that for now will be a good way of testing some propositions that might begin to get traction once the more international economy begins to get going again. And then finally, so as well as this market intelligence, thinking about what the market needs and being able to respond to it very quickly. Another element that you do flag up in the report, which I think is very important, is the need for trade bodies, trade associations, networks, support that enables particularly freelancers, micro businesses, people working in the informal economy to rethink the kind of skills they need to work in this new market. It doesn't mean necessarily upskilling, it means reskilling. And again, I'll come back to that in a moment. So what I'd like to do is, thinking about what your role is in the immediate future of the Sri Lanka economy. That sounds a rather kind of grand statement, but the thing I'd just like to spend a moment talking about is, what's the relationship between the creative industries as a sector that you've defined in the report, and you've done a lot of detailed work on in the report, and the wider creative economy? And I've got 2 points on that. One is really a kind of structural issue, and one is a more philosophical issue, if you like. And the structural issue is this. There's a guy called Robert Hewison. He's a cultural commentator in the UK, and a couple of years ago he wrote this. It's the configuration of relationships that gives a system its essential characteristics. Thus, it is less helpful to define the creative economy by what it does than try to understand how it is organized. It's a very interesting point. How is it organized? Well, as I was saying a moment ago, one of the key features of it is ideas are worth more than products. And a great example of that, iPhones, most of the world's iPhones are made in Shenzhen in China by a company called Foxconn. Foxconn retain something like 6 or 10% of the value of the iPhone for making it. Apple retains 60% of the value, the price of an iPhone, because they designed it. And in fact, it was designed essentially by one man, Johnny Ive, an art student, a graduate of the Royal College of Art in London. That's where the value lies. So one of the characteristics of the creative economy is it's all about soft skills. It's about investing in intangibles, in human beings, in software. It's not about investing in physical property. That's a challenge for businesses, and as I was saying earlier, a challenge for bankers. There's another issue, which again I've also referred to, and that is one of its characteristics is it tends to be labor intensive, not capital intensive. The chief executive of British Telecom was very fond of joking that all you need to start a business in the 21st century is a smart kid with a smartphone. And the point he was making was that you don't need huge investment to make a business work. You need a good idea and a means of communicating it. It's a very, very different dynamic. And of course, one of the things is a smart kid with a smartphone does not imply somebody who's got an MBA from Stanford. It implies somebody who's a smart kid, maybe semi-literate, but if they've got that kind of creative talent, and there are so many kids now who understand how to work in a visual medium much more readily than they can work in a literate medium, there are all kinds of changes in what we think of as the skills that we need to succeed. So it's a labor-intensive world with a very different set of characteristics from the traditional 20th century world. And then another point is it's very much about niche production, not mass production. If we say that the typical model of a successful 20th century economy was mass production, mass consumption, capital intensive, big companies, big marketing, what typifies the creative economy, one of its characteristics is that it's niche, it's bespoke, it moves fast, points I was making before. And of course, you have a strong representation in the garment industry, in the apparel industry, and all of you will know much better than me that in the retail world now, the companies that can switch almost week by week to stay up with consumer demand and consumer habits are the ones that are succeeding. So this flexibility, this agility, this responsiveness is absolutely crucial. Then another point that relates to that, one of the characteristics I would say of this creative economy is failure is not disaster, it's work in progress. The people who invented the game Candy Crush, which is worth however many $1 billion now, that was the 43rd game that they launched. The first 42 didn't succeed, but they treated each one as a learning experience. So failure is not a disaster, it's work in progress. Different dynamic, and very, very important to think about that. And then another point, which again I've touched on, in this new creative economy world, collaboration is as important as competition. And that's happening everywhere. I went to an advanced manufacturing centre in the north of England recently on materials for aeronautics. And I found engineers from Boeing, Rolls-Royce, British Aerospace, Doughty, Airbus, all working together. I said, I thought you guys were meant to be in competition with each other. They laughed and they said, we have to collaborate. We're working together on cracking ideas. Once we've got the ideas and we know how to commercialize them, then we compete. So it's a much more collaborative economy. And that means collaboration across sectors, across regions, even across countries, across different businesses. And we've got to be much more open to that. And then finally, of course, it's an economy that is rooted in culture. That's why it's called the cultural and creative economy. And a recent front cover of The Economist magazine presented the argument that the amount of money that has been spent investing in content in the last 5 years, and by that they mean film, video games, music, is around $650 billion. And they then say, this is almost exactly the same as the amount of money that's been invested in oil and gas in the last 5 years. So the storytelling industry, which we may think of as, it's froth on the cake, it's not substance. This industry is now worth as much in the global economy as the oil and gas industry that underpins still our energy infrastructure. It's hugely important. And is going to go on being more important. So then that takes me to my final points, which are the philosophical points. And a great American anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, was very fond of saying, his definition of culture was stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. That's a typical anthropologist's definition of culture, but it's an interesting one. So you're in the cultural and creative sector. What's the story that you're telling yourselves? What's the story that you're telling your fellow citizens in Sri Lanka? What's the story that you're helping to tell to the world? It's about how you do business. It's the kind of quality of the business. It's how you come across as people, as businesses, as individuals. What's the story? And what's the story for Sri Lanka? And if there's a Sri Lanka story, do the creative and cultural industries of Sri Lanka contribute to that story or detract from it? Are you leaders in building a creative economy, or are you laggards in pulling back from other sectors that are being more creative? And so let me finish with a couple of other thoughts. In Indonesia, city of Bandung in West Java, 10 years ago, started thinking about itself in very kind of creative ways. And there's a network of around 200 cities in Indonesia that call themselves the Creative Cities Network. And they have 10 principles that they sign up to. And the principles are about transparent government, about responsible use of energy, about waste management, and so on. But one of the 10 principles is this: a city that maintains the wisdom of history while building the spirit of reform to create a better future for all its people. What a great idea. In other words, it's saying the only way you build the future is by remembering the stories of the past and building on them. And then, final question, that's not just about the creative and cultural industries, that's about what's the story that the society is telling itself. So here's another quote, again from Indonesia. It's from the president, Joko Widodo. I came across this the other day and it really surprised me. He said, "The creative economy will be the pillar of the Indonesian economy. We need a leap to boost industries such as agriculture, fisheries, and manufacturing to become extraordinary when driven by creativity." Agriculture, fisheries, manufacturing, are these part of the creative economy? His point is they can be, because it's a matter of how they're organized, how they think about themselves. So I come back to my initial point, which is what's the contribution of your sector to telling this overall story of Sri Lanka developing a creative economy? Now that's a very kind of big, romantic, ambitious notion. And we have to start with some practicalities. And you started with the practicalities by laying out in this excellent report the data that's needed to pin down what's going on in this sector, some of the issues that need to be addressed, some of the strengths that you've got, some of the weaknesses that you've got. It's a brilliant starting point. But I think that in implementing some of the proposals that you have in this report, don't forget there's this much bigger story of how are you contributing to a real creative future for the whole of Sri Lanka. And I look forward now to our panel discussion. We have a little bit more time today, and I hope that we'll have more time in the future. And thank you for listening to me.
You mentioned telling stories. We have no shortage of stories to tell in Sri Lanka. We are abundant with traditions and cultures and all, crafts and everything. But we somehow are we struggling to unlock this creativity and make it part of the wider economy? What is it that you feel holds cultures and countries back from leveraging on that?
It's a very good question. Well, I think let me start an answer to that with an example. In South Korea, absolutely a manufacturing economy. About 15 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe, they decided they really needed to think about promoting Korean culture, and they've invested a lot. And, so K-pop has become a worldwide phenomenon. They said, okay, this is important to project a different kind of image of Korea. They've just won the Oscar for Best Film, the first time a non-English language film has ever won. Now, did they make a pretend Hollywood movie? No, they made a very Korean story in a very Korean way, but it has universal appeal. And I think that that's why I was talking about this distinctiveness. It's not about trying to make Sri Lankan stories turn into Hollywood movies. It's about how you tell them in a Sri Lankan way, but in a way that has universal appeal. And I often think, some of the most successful film franchises of all time, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, these are very, very peculiar, quirky books about societies which most people have no understanding of whatsoever. Harry Potter is a complete mystery to me, but somehow these things have universal appeal. And I think it's having the confidence to tell your stories in your way. But, and this is where I think you've got a kind of strength in this whole island of innovation idea, it's being responsive to the conversations that you're having. It's market intelligence. It's picking up where trends are moving. And how do you interpret those traditional stories in a way that makes sense in a modern context? But I mean, of course, I said what I said because I know that, Sri Lanka has got a fantastic tradition of stories from different traditions. And I do think that's something to think about building on.
Thank you, John. Would you like to bring in your panel now? And
sure, I will do. Okay, so can the panel join me? And I'm very pleased to welcome, I hope, to the panel, Selyna.
Hello. Hi, John.
Hi. Thank you for joining us, Selyna. Now, for everybody who's listening and watching, Selyna is Head of Business Development for Selyne, which is Sri Lanka's only fair trade handloom company and one of the country's largest social enterprises. She also has a background as a lawyer and a diplomat, which I said to her earlier, I think those are essential qualifications for any creative entrepreneur. So very good to see you, Selyna. Thanks for joining us. And Linda, who is a creative entrepreneur, I know works in the fashion sector also. Linda, are you there to join us?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. And finally, Anushka, who is an economist. And for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk with Selyna and Linda about their experience as entrepreneurs. But we wanted to have Anushka involved as an economist who also has a background in government and in policy making. So we can test some of these ideas and how they get traction in Sri Lanka. So could I start by asking both of you, Selyna and Linda, one of the things that strikes me about this report is that it's got quite a few recommendations for government. It's things that you would like the government to do to help support the sector. That's, of course, very important. But I'd like to ask you both what you think you as private entrepreneurs or as social entrepreneurs in the sector could be doing to help yourselves, if you like. What are the things that the sector could and should be doing of its own accord that would help to grow it and also grow its profile within Sri Lanka? Selyna, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you, John. Just before that, I was shaking my head so much at everything you were saying in your keynote. It's so exciting to hear some of the things you've been saying, because those are the very conversations we've been having, especially in the social enterprise network. So just to jump right into this, I think as a sector, we've always helped ourselves. And in this case, I think the key to going forward is to organize ourselves. I'm not one for structures personally. I'm not one who really favors associations and all these things, but I think looking at the report and looking at the experience that we've had over the years, if we as a creative sector are to be recognized and we are able to fill in the gaps that are in the large identified surge sectors in the country, such as economy, such as tourism, the garment industry, etc., I think the time has come to organize ourselves into a formation such as ICTA or JAF in Sri Lanka, which is a sector of the IT network and also the garment manufacturers. So, I mean, what I always find is we are in the peripheries of larger sectors. And if we are to really take the opportunities, especially in a post-COVID situation, there is a need for that kind of organization. But that's the short answer to what you asked, John.
Okay, thank you. Linda.
Yeah, so, sorry. Yeah, so I think first is, John, like when I look at the report, I mean, it was developed at a time, pre-pandemic time. So for me, the first step would be to really look at the current context, actually. I mean, for sure, we are going to inherit a whole new world. And that's one key dimension. I mean, in a way, we are at the beginning of something, the whole creative industries, this whole report. It's a great beginning. So important to look at the kind of space we are in right now. So for me, that would be a starting point. The second is, obviously, it's also an interesting phase of the 21st century itself. There, I mean, biotech, infotech, it's going to drive a whole new, different world. So again, where does that put the creative industries in? So what's the role the creative industries is going to play in these big macro changes? And to me, I think it comes down to one key thing, is that creativity by nature, disruption is our DNA. And I think the industry as a whole, the creative talent, the creative industry people, all of that, if we can look at embracing that disruption and really looking at how to build this new world with that really as a core skill. So really looking at, with this report, how do we leapfrog? Because just because we caught up with the rest of the world, talking about the creative industries, that doesn't really give us, any reason to go back and, come through the same timelines. So I think some of the things you touched, John, in your presentation, that, opportunity, talent is everywhere, but opportunity isn't. So really in this new world, looking at what are the key opportunities that are there, and how can we leapfrog and position the creative industries? How can we make it work for Sri Lanka? What is the impact it's going to drive? So I think, like Selyna also touched on, working on a whole organized network. I think the British Council report touches on key things, the whole sustainable island concept, organizing a structure, but all looking at it with the view of what is the role the creative industries is going to play in this new post-pandemic world. Personally, I have also seen that the last 4 weeks, we've been able to drive innovation that we haven't driven at all, I think, in the past, because I think naturally the current situation is lending itself as more welcoming to disruption. So I think the creative industries having disruption as your DNA has a key role to play. And I'm also just thinking how we can really structure that into an organized thing to take it to the next level for Sri Lanka, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you both. There's a number of things that I'd like to pick up there. And then Anushka, I'll come to you later on, if that's okay, in the discussion. But first of all, could you both say something briefly about the investment situation in your sector? Because that's touched on in the report. Of course, it's true of every economy in the world that creative entrepreneurs find it difficult to persuade financiers and investors to take their businesses seriously. I'm sure that's an issue for you. And I just wondered what you think the sector could be doing for itself to ameliorate that situation.
So if I can jump in first, Linda, I think you would probably have more to say on this matter, but again, being an older like the way it happens in Sri Lanka is you have to have a kind of a very strong structure and a formalized structure, a kind of a good reputation if you are to get that kind of traditional funding from banks. But then recently you have seen the impact investors coming, the angel investors coming, who are giving space to these disruptors to actually grow their ideas. So again, I have to go back to that earlier point that I have said, because largely some of the kind of sectors or organizations within our industry is informal, loosely set up. These are not good, they are essential maybe for creativity, but it's not really conducive to attract investors. So it's a matter of bringing the investors one step to the middle, and also to a certain extent formalizing some of the structures that are formalizing some of the structures for creative business. That's the way I see it, and I see in that a lot of guidance that some of the established organizations within the creative sector can give to the rest of the space. And that is where I think, John, what you touched upon earlier, the whole sense of collaboration, vouching, it's creating a different, I think the creative industry can't be set up like any other industry. There is heart in it. And I strongly believe when I say that. So that is where the collaboration comes in, the vouching, the mentorship, all of that comes in to then give the confidence to the investors that the industry as a whole is something that they should invest in.
Yes.
That's the way I see it.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And Linda, I'd like to come to you in a moment, but just, Selyna, as you say that, if you forgive me, two thoughts occur to me about the way things work in Creative England. we have, of course, the same business, tiny businesses. They go to the bank and they want to raise such a small amount of money that the bank's not interested. And eventually what we've been able to do at Creative England, we've recently launched a fund. A bank has given us a £25 million fund for us to invest. We guaranteed them a rate of return, which is a risk for us. But we've said to them essentially, you guys will never understand these businesses, but we do. Give us the money and we'll invest it. And interestingly, it's a social enterprise bank that's done that, Triodos. They're the only ones that have got the confidence to do that. But I think that's an example, that's a kind of collaboration which requires a trade association or a body or a network or something like Creative England. And then another initiative which has worked quite well in the UK, it may not be remotely applicable in the Sri Lankan context, but we started a program which we called Big Guy, Little Guy Partnerships. And essentially it was, so we went to Sony and said, we have 10 very small companies that you will never have heard of, but we think they've got great ideas. Will you invest some money in them? We will invest some money in them. They will retain the intellectual property, but let's see what happens. And it was very successful because the big company, Sony, got the benefit of the creativity, but the small companies, they got the benefit of a big company saying, why aren't you protecting your intellectual property? Why haven't you got a proper business plan? Why aren't you thinking about international markets? So it was a real mutual process of learning. And then we repeated that with Microsoft, we've done that with Disney, and in fact, we even did it with the National Health Service of inviting video games businesses to develop software for people with early stage dementia to manage their own healthcare. And the health service invested in video games makers because we could come up with some solutions which the clinicians were not able to access. So those are just examples about collaboration. And that's why I think collaboration across sectors and across disciplines and across different sizes of company is very important. But sorry, I just couldn't resist saying that to you, Selyna. But Linda, the question about finance and the problems of accessing finance, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, so first is, I mean, I've had like 10 plus years experience trying to do exactly that. So we just set up the Colombo Innovation Tower in Sri Lanka, John. It's 20 floors, 120,000 square feet. But I also, I mean, it was set up and Innovation Island is something we came up with 2 years ago. My friends at the Public Works came up with it for us to position what we were trying to do. Again, you know, that's meant to be a hub to drive innovation, to drive the creative industries. I mean, I started my journey with the British Council in 2009, getting to know the whole creative industries. So I think that's one phase over. So, and really right now, what I see is it's like a watershed moment. Again, like how do we now utilize what we have and make a bigger, like a big, many others also able to join that whole movement. So with regard to banks and funding, so, you know, to fund this big building, I had my own challenges to try to raise capital, even with an entrepreneurial track record. But even now, like I know that the first thing probably everybody is thinking is, oh gosh, it's real estate now, what's going to happen, right, with post-COVID. But I'm sitting and thinking, oh my gosh, finally, I actually get the chance to do what I actually set out to do with this building, to drive innovation, Innovation Island, all of that. But of course, I mean, I have the fortune of having bankers who trust the track record. So like you said, John, I mean, we are also looking at like, how can we be a catalyst? Like, I mean, could we take a startup fund? So for example, we've set up Colombo Innovation Tower Labs, how to have a fund and how to, we've just tied up with a UK university to launch a 1-year master's program, but not necessarily rooted in education, rooted in entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
So within that 1 year, you have this parallel lab where you take everybody, you treat every idea as a startup idea, and through the end, you get bankers to everyone. So kind of really being a catalyst for to fledge out all of these businesses. So that's kind of at an individual level how I see our role. And I think there might be a few players like that who also may come in and play that game. So that's the only solution I can see to take it forward. And I'm also in this thinking moment right now.
Okay, thank you. Look, I'd like to ask you both, we're getting fairly short on time. We've got 5 or 10 minutes now, but I'd like to ask you both about hubs and clusters and co-working spaces. Linda, you've just referred to that. And if you see that in terms of organizing a very, very fragmented sector, if that's something that would be of particular or is of value in Sri Lanka, or if that's something that you think is interesting. But just before, so could you both think about that? And Anushka, if you're there, could I just ask you, would you like to comment on what's been said by Selyna and Linda on this point about, well, really what I really want to ask you is, how do you think the sector should be and could be presenting itself more effectively to government and to the financial institutions? Are you there, Anush?
Yes, I'm here, John.
Okay, great. So, did you hear my question? Is that a fair question to ask you? Sorry, I mean, it would take about an hour and a half to answer, but I'm sure you can condense it into a couple of minutes.
Sure, I'll take a quick stab at it, but I think you, Selyna, and Linda covered a lot of really interesting ground. So let me just touch on a few things. So I think the first is economists are preoccupied constantly, particularly those who work in trade and competitiveness are preoccupied with how a country needs to look for new sources of competitiveness, new sources of diversification and dynamism, particularly exports. And I think positioning the creative industries as a vehicle for Sri Lanka's new push for competitiveness, diversification, and dynamism would be one really good way to ensure that we see these industries as mainstream throughout the economy and not in their own sector.
Yeah.
So for me, as someone who knows very little about this industry, apart from knowing great people and great brands like Selyna's, Linda's, and there are other friends on the call, I see this sector beyond what it is in itself, but rather what it can do for the wider economy. There's also really, as you pointed out, John, there's a lot of interesting things happening in different quote unquote traditional sectors or mainstream sectors, whether it's in food and beverage, whether it's in apparels, and also in tourism. And in many of these, they're struggling to create a new identity, a new element of competitiveness and differentiation. And I think the creative industries can do just that. I picked just one sector, tourism. And I know the linkages between tourism and creative industries are quite obvious. But specifically in Sri Lanka, I'll ask everyone to look at this wonderful vision document called the Tourism Vision and the Tourism Strategic Plan. It was done a couple of years ago, but it's continuing even though there's been a regime change, and that's really interesting. In that, the focus is entirely on authenticity, and positioning Sri Lanka as an authentic tourism destination. And I think this is a beautiful way to leverage that positioning of authenticity along with Sri Lanka's creative industries. A quick one on the financing. I think both Selyna and Linda's businesses are well-established businesses. I sit on the board of a bank. I would have no problem recommending these kind of businesses, but most businesses in this sector aren't. So there's clearly a market failure there. Yeah. Banks, by their very nature, I mean, if we keep just banging on to banks saying, oh, but you should be lending to us, you should be, they're not going to care, because banks are responsible for their depositors' money. They're not just bad people. So the solution then is to try and bridge that gap between what banks do and what you want. And whether that's through alternative sources of finance or helping banks better understand something as simple as a group of you sitting down with the Sri Lanka Bankers Association and saying, give us 1 hour, we will convince you that there's an industry that if you don't invest in, you're going to miss the bus. I can guarantee you that at the end of the presentation with people like Selyna, Linda, and others, they'll be convinced. I don't think anyone's done that yet.
Thank you. That is a beautiful answer. And it reminds me immediately, as a man, Patrick McKenna, who's one of the most successful media investors in the UK, the film Avatar, which you remember is one of the biggest grossing films of all time, was one of his investments. And he's very fond of saying, I don't understand what's the point of trying to teach creative people business skills. They're not good at business. what we should be doing is teaching them social skills so that they can become friends with bankers and lawyers, and then they can explain themselves. And in a way, that's what you're saying, that actually it's, and Anushka, I think, you know, you're right. So many creative entrepreneurs complain that bankers don't understand them, but equally bankers say, well, if people come and they have no business plan, they just have a great idea, why should we invest in it? And I think, so finding some way of making these conversations work at a level of kind of social trust, as you've just said, is incredibly important. But there's a couple of questions coming in on the side, but I would like to come back to Selyna and Linda just very quickly to ask you about how you see the role of hubs, clusters, co-working spaces, these ideas of people kind of working together. In many cities and in quite a few countries, they've become a kind of centerpiece of creative industry policy thinking. And I just wondered what your views on that were. Linda, perhaps you go first, and then Selyna.
Yeah, so I think exactly to play the kind of role that you mentioned, John. So like you said, you know, like even my bankers, I don't think they understand half of the time what I'm talking about, right? But they still back me. So I think particularly the role of the hub is to educate bankers, educate all of these people as to what the sector can deliver. So I think that's number one. And the other is educating the sector itself. So figuring out some kind of membership or some kind of model, because the sector itself think economics, finance is a dirty word. I mean, I have that challenge most times to educate even our own designers that it's not a dirty word. Nobody's going to respect you for a lifestyle business, right? You've got to deliver. So I think it's a two-pronged approach, and I think a hub like particularly ourselves definitely should play that role, because we are creative industry specific and creative economy and creative industries with a view to generating wealth and jobs. So I think that's going to be certainly one of our roles with regard to our hub, and also positioning the country and getting these creative industries to deliver for Sri Lanka.
Okay, thank you. Selyna.
John, so all the co-working spaces, the kind of incubators, and all these necessary prerequisites you said to actually fostering and growing creativity is very Colombo-centric, and it is not offered in local languages, which is a huge challenge, because my business is based outside of Colombo, and frankly, if I wasn't speaking English and didn't have a British education and didn't know certain people, I wouldn't be here, you know. And I think that's a massive challenge for the creative sector in the country, and also I think a larger challenge to Sri Lanka as a whole, because a lot of the frustrations of our people are based on this divide, right? So I think that's a divide the creative industries can cross. And again, I go back to my point that if the onus falls on us.
Ooh.
Hello? Is everyone hearing me? Yeah, okay. So I think the onus falls on us as industry leaders. When I say us, likes of Celine, likes of the AOD, it falls on really us to gather this sector and to give the confidence to the entrepreneurs, the ideators, the thinkers who are thinking in other languages. And I'm not just saying Sinhalese and Tamil, but with different mindsets, that, you know, there is a future for this, for you. I mean, this is a really long answer to this question, but I feel like the creative industries has this potential to go down to address some of the core issues of our society, which you have, for example, parents telling kids not to take on creative professions, you know? Things like that. I mean, I don't want to go on more, but I feel that all these spaces which are needed for the industry to flourish are Colombo-centric, and that's a huge challenge to the sector at the moment.
Yes. Thank you. So I lost you a little bit there. There was the link broke down temporarily. I think this thing of the, I come back, it's such an easy slogan, talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. But it seems to me that is the core of what we should be doing. The world is at a time when we cannot afford to waste the creative abilities of people. And it interests me that so often social enterprise and creative enterprise seem to go together, because it's true that these are sectors where the economic significance has to underpin things, but the social and cultural significance is what is really important. And that's the John Kay point. The only real meaning of economic benefit is something that is a benefit to people, not just to shareholders and to GDP figures. I'm sorry, but we're out of time on this section, because we're now going to take some questions from the audience, and Mrinali's been collecting some. So Mrinali, I hope you're going to give us those questions. Anushka, I know you're going to have an opportunity to come back at the end of the session in 15 or 20 minutes to do a summing up. I'm sorry we weren't able to include, these two entrepreneurs have got too much to say. I'm sorry, but we'll come back to you a little bit later in the session. But now we're going to, for all four of us, I think, questions from Mrinali. What have you got for us?
John, in the interest of time, I think I will collate and ask one big
Okay.
question. All right, because there is a question around the education system. You talked about storytelling. Anushka talked about authenticity. Selyna talked about, what it looks like at grassroots level. And Linda talked about talking to financiers and investors. So what is missing in the education system in the way that design and creativity is taught that, is not helping the industry or the sector? I hope that's a coherent question, but I'm trying to put a lot of ideas together to make one sort of question. Is that a tough one?
Yes, it's a very tough one. I think we have
because it says that, we have inherited a very archaic model of education.
Yes.
So
we have a huge problem with the education system. Most of the very successful entrepreneurs I know, particularly in the film business and the TV business, left school as soon as they could. They hated school. It didn't do anything for them. We have to. What does that teach us? I think that we have to have. I mean, collaboration is key to this economy, but collaboration in school is called cheating. I mean, it's, we have some very, very fundamental issues to deal with. And I think that the emphasis on academic skills, of course that's important, but we have to start with encouraging people to feel able to express their creativity, and as importantly, to appreciate the creativity of other people. It's about sharing and learning, and our education systems don't do that. It's if anything, in the UK at the moment, I think we're heading in completely the wrong direction. We're going more towards exams and rote learning, and the one thing that most people in business are saying is we need people who have social skills and who have the ability to learn. So learning how to learn is something which our education systems on the whole don't do very well. People are going to have to go on learning throughout their lives, even if they're starting from a very low level. So I think I've got no easy answers to this, but I think that, and it's no comfort to say that if this is a huge problem you have in Sri Lanka, it's a problem in every country in the world. I was recently doing a talk in Sao Paulo in Brazil. At the end of it, 10 or 15 people came up to me and said, what do we do about the fact that our kids are learning stuff in school which is going to be no benefit to them in dealing with this new world? I think it's a huge problem that we all face. Of course, there are some great and exciting examples of alternative practice, but it's easy to criticize the system. It's very, very terrifying for politicians to start messing around with the education system, but we've got to do it. I don't know, Selyna, Linda, Anushka, what do you think about this?
Actually, I've got something to add, John, because most of the problems in Sri Lanka come from our education system. So what I feel is that, I mean, we can't change it. We really can't. And, I actually wasted 3 years of my life, not wasted, invested 3 years of my life, Freudian slip, to do some of those changes. But what I feel is that is also an opportunity for the creative sector, because most of these values, these the ability for children to be able to learn is a gap that the arts and the crafts and the creatives with film and song can fill. You know, so the whole concept of neighborhood is going to become so relevant, especially after the post-COVID
Yes.
pandemic. And I think there's an opportunity for that kind of business actually to penetrate into neighborhoods, to bring back those values. So I mean, while yes, I fully recognize that the education system has to change. I think if we in Sri Lanka wait for that to happen, we're just going to miss every bus that's coming our way. So the sector, again, your point, how can the sector help itself? How can we within the sector be part of the supply chains, be part of the value chains? How can we create business and social enterprise that fill in these gaps, which are going to then in turn grow our sector? I think those are real questions we have to ask ourselves in Sri Lanka at this moment in time.
Thanks. Linda.
Yeah, so I think as someone who in the education sector, I mean, you know, I find that that sector is pretty obsolete, and I think Sri Lanka has been a relatively young entrant into, say, the creative industry space. I think has to leapfrog and do something different. So even right now, like I said, I see ourselves also in a watershed moment. So I mean, the Academy of Design, which I founded, is just 15 plus years old, but still, I mean, I had to found the Artificial Intelligence Academy just earlier this year to push AOD to, you know, catch up, because I found it in its own right becoming obsolete, and design itself needing to, you know, reinvent itself to stay relevant. So I think it's currently it's for every sector, not only education. Every sector has to disrupt itself pretty fast. The cycle is really, really fast. So I think one is the higher education sector, which is pretty fresh on the creative industry space. I think definitely like we are particularly going in for a whole new model now. So I think that sector has to keep reinventing itself. If not, it's completely obsolete. As you know, people like Google and everyone, they are doing their own education because they can't rely on the higher education sector to deliver. And we know that many young people are not going to go into traditional education. So I think that space, we are leading it in a new way, and we have to make sure we leapfrog and lead with the correct mentality. And the other is what Selyna touched on, which is more on a school level, the kind of raw material that we are inheriting to the higher education also we need to really look at. So again, that is, I think you touched on your presentation, and I think we can do a bit more as to bringing in creative education into the whole school system. So I think that's a bigger, more macro picture problem. But I think the higher education sector, which is pretty new, we can still, I think, lead that in a good way in South Asia, is my view.
Yes. Thank you. Anushka, would you like to comment on that? And I've noticed that in the chat function, Tanya put up a point saying, let's stop having an us and them discussion about what's happening in finance. And Anushka, you agreed with that. So you might want to make a brief comment on that as well. But could you say what you think on this issue of the relevance or the irrelevance of much of the education system to what's needed in the economy today?
I think, John, you brought in the point about the fourth industrial revolution and automation and so on, and what's becoming really clear, and it's been quantified in reports done by the World Economic Forum, for instance, that the kind of jobs that aren't routine jobs that require creativity are going to be very much in demand across sectors. Now, the challenge is in Sri Lanka, we're still catching up with the STEM education era because we didn't invest in science, technology, engineering, and maths. So now you need to go and tell policymakers, actually, let's do STEM, but let's also now do creativity. So I think just in terms of helping policymakers understand why you want them to pivot or provide additional resources to these new areas is important. And I think positioning it in terms of, let's look at what the economy is going to look like 20, 30, 40 years from now, and not just try to play catch up. And if we use that narrative, I think reminding folks that creativity will underpin everything, creative thinking. Let's stop you know, vilifying art subjects. It's something that economists have done for a long time. We've pushed STEM, 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 but even in art subjects, bringing in, you know, it's just about improving education, how we teach overall, whichever subject it is. So that's the quick comment on that. I haven't thought very deeply about the specific skills required for specific creative industries. On Tanya's question or comment, I fully agree. And it speaks to this point about creative industries, professionals in it, the organizations that are in it, supporting institutions that are in it, need to now see themselves embedding into spaces outside of the industry, whether that's more with finance or with business development service providers, supply chain folks, managerial institutions, because collaboration is, we all love it, but no one really does a good job of putting it together individually. It almost has public good qualities about it. So who's going to help drive that collaboration? And I think the anchor businesses, the anchor founders in this space in Sri Lanka can play a large role to look beyond their own enterprises and reach out to folks, even when it may not be commercially viable, but in the spirit of growing that sector as a whole and driving very specific collaborations. For example, I noticed that one of the challenges picked up in the report is about top rank concern is about availability of raw materials. I think that's solvable. And this is a problem that some traditional sectors like the ceramics and glass sector had 10, 15 years ago. They came together as an industry and they started joint procurement. They got better rates. They solved the procurement and raw material availability issues faced by individual enterprises. And they were able to solve that for more people than the lead firms. So I think these are some things that can be looked at in terms of driving the industry as a whole.
Yes, I think I want to just come back on the education point for a moment, but on the point you just raised, Anushka, I think this thing of, as in many sectors of the economy, but I think creative entrepreneurs and the creative sector, partly because it's so fragmented, this thinking about supply chains is something we're very, very poor at doing. And for me, I worked in the film industry for a while, and the European film industry has always focused on production. It's all about the filmmaker. The Hollywood industry has always focused on distribution. It's about who's going to go and see the movie. And, which is the more successful industry, the Hollywood industry or the European industry? They have absolutely thought about their supply chains in Hollywood. And it doesn't mean that they take the creative side of it less seriously, but they take the business side of it very seriously. And I think there are so many areas in the creative industries where we still allow, it's not just a divide between us and them in terms of finance, but it's a divide between us as the producers and the world that we're trying to access. But I think on just a final word on the education point, it seems to me all around the world, as the global economy becomes more competitive, governments are compelled to see education as a way of preparing citizens purely for their role in the labor force. It's not about them preparing them for their role as adult human beings and citizens. England has got some of the best schools in the world. They're all private schools that cost a huge amount of money. But if you go to them, and wealthy people around the world send their kids to these schools because as well as getting good maths and literacy, they're getting music, drama, sport. They're allowing these kids to develop as fully rounded human beings, not just as people who can get a Stanford MBA and make a ton of money. And I think that's the kind of core struggle that we got going on in the education system, if you like. Mrinali, I think we may be out of time.
Yes. I think we need to move on to the next part of the agenda.
Okay. Can I say thank you all very much, Selyna, Linda, and Anushka. We're going to hear from you again in a moment, but thank you for your contributions. It's been a very interesting discussion.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Mrinali.
Jill, over to you, Jill.
Thank you. And just a huge thank you from me to John and the panelists, for giving us, I think, just about an hour or more than an hour of really in-depth insight and discussion. So thank you very much. It was fascinating, and we really, in a sense, we wish we didn't have to come to an end, but we are running slightly late, but it's not an issue. We'll go on for another 15 minutes, I think. What we want to do in this last session is think about the future. What are the concluding remarks? What are the concluding recommendations? What is it we want to take forward, not just from the report, but from this very interesting discussion that we've had today? And I'm going to, in the interest of time, of course, invite just 3 of our contributors today to step forward with their thoughts. And the first one is Annemarie de Silva. If I can have you on screen. John, you're on screen already, that's great. And Anushka, thank you very much. I'd like to have you on screen as well. Brilliant, thank you very much. And so I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to, in a sense, have the last words for this session. Start with Annemarie, move to John, and give the very last word to Anush. So, Annemarie de Silva, I'm very aware that there was a huge amount of data, a huge amount of information, of research, and you did some of your own as well. And you went through all of that in record time, for which we're very grateful. What I want you to do is to think back about, as you were going through all of that, and to tell us what was the one major insight that you had? What was the single opportunity that really stood out for you as you went through that process?
Sure. As I said before, I think one of the really valuable aspects of the report is the voice that it gave to people in the creative sectors in different industries, and kind of a continuous, a common strand that I saw between each of the subsectors was this desire to be involved in the global value chain, but the inability to participate in it, whether that's access to markets or, at whatever level, even if it's connecting to, say, the domestic connection in that global chain. And it got me thinking in terms of how we actually value, what are the preconditions that we need in order to have that successful integration of people in creative industries in Sri Lanka to the global value chain. And I think something that is really missing is the way that we value labor and knowledge in developing countries. And this is something that's common to creative sectors in developing countries across the world. And just as kind of like to exemplify this through kind of a thought experiment, if you were to see kind of a handcrafted object in an art shop in, say, Shoreditch in the UK, or maybe the Blue Mountains in Australia, in like a nice glassed art house, you pick up that object, you know that a craftsperson has made that. You go to the counter, pay for it, and we all have an idea of how much we would pay for it. How would you behave there compared to when you're in Delhi or in Chiang Mai in Thailand, or even in Sri Lanka, and there's a bazaar person, a person at a bazaar selling the same kind of crafts on the street to you? In one context, we're willing to pay that premium and acknowledge the labor and knowledge that's gone into creating that object, as well as the supply chain that has brought that object to you as a consumer. In the other, somehow it's socially acceptable to haggle, to actively participate in devaluing both the labor knowledge and production line that's brought that to you. And this isn't to point fingers at consumers, but the thing is, this is kind of the underlying issue that then relates to how it relates to other macro issues as well. Now we didn't get to talk too much about IP, but the report definitely does. And just to give you a concrete example of how our day-to-day decisions affect macro level issues is there's something to do with the World Intellectual Property Office. They created an intergovernmental committee on recognizing IP for traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and genetic resources. And this is it's a really important IP framework for countries like Sri Lanka that use indigenous knowledge in order to create these products and services. Now, it was established in 1999, and it is still stagnant. It has been 20 years in the making to create a international legal instrument that would adequately value and protect the IP of these communities. And the big hold on that is global North countries that are in the committee as well, who are pushing back on it, because that would mean that there would be a greater commercial valuation. Now, this is not something that we're not participating in. The representatives in this committee, they are representing the views of each of our countries. So if it is possible to pressure those representatives in order to make those changes at the global scale, but it hinges on each of our, us as business people, as consumers, as educators, policymakers, domestically. It hinges on our participation as well, and how we can pressure what decisions we make personally, and how we can pressure those interest bodies as well. So I think my takeaway and sort of direction for the future based on the report is that it is really important to link to the global value chain, and I think companies like Linda's and Selyna's does that incredibly well, and they're really important cogs. But in order to successfully do that, we need to value the labor and knowledge that comes out of places like Sri Lanka. So I think that's really my takeaway from the report.
Apologies, I was muted. Thank you very much. Yeah, a very salient point. Thank you, Annemarie. John, I'd like to turn to you now, and bearing in mind both your UK and your international experience, what would you want to say to us in Sri Lanka? What would be the one takeaway that you would recommend?
Well, I will answer that, but just I thought what Annemarie just said is incredibly important. It's and great that you said that, Annemarie. Thank you. It's a very, very important issue. And on this question of IP, one thing that's very clear during this COVID pandemic is that the power of the online platforms is only going to increase. And they also are experts at devaluing creativity. People expect stuff in the online world to be free. And if the new normal is that things online are going to be free, it is completely unsustainable. So I think this issue of intellectual property, particularly if world trade and an international cultural experience is increasingly going to be online, we really have some fundamental issues to crack in terms of thinking about that. In terms of a takeaway, I think what I said earlier, it's a slow business persuading governments, parents, bankers, entrepreneurs to change the way they think and work. And I think, this report is a really good starting point. At the beginning, Dilanie and Annemarie emphasized the difficulty of accessing some of the data, but now you've got a foundation to build on that, and to connect it with this idea of the island of innovation, to connect it with this rich heritage of stories that you have in Sri Lanka, and to connect that with the growing reputation of ethical and environmental responsibility and sustainability. That is a very powerful hand of cards, a difficult hand of cards to play. It's going to be difficult for everybody going forward, but I think these are real strengths. And so I'll finish by saying this. Every 3 years or so, the UN produces a report on the state of the global creative economy. The one they produced in 2013 had 100 case studies from cities around the world. And one of the things they said is, in their looking at these initiatives, the ones that succeeded were the ones that started by looking at a neighborhood's assets and capabilities, not at its needs. And I think for Sri Lanka, in this creative economy debate, not to look at the needs in a way, which is it's a small sector, not particularly recognized, imports outweigh exports, etc., but to look at the assets and capabilities. That has got to be the starting point of the next stage in policy development. And I think it could be a very exciting and positive process.
Thank you, John. I'm now going to turn to Anush, and I should have said at the beginning, as an economist, his particular specialism is innovation and economic competitiveness. So bearing that in mind, I'm giving the last word to you, and I would like to ask you, what will be your recommendation on the next step on the way forward?
Thanks, Jill. And my overall recommendation would be build the visibility and credibility and legitimacy of this industry. And the one probably most important thing you can do is use this fantastic report by IPS, Annemarie and others to rally around other stakeholders in this industry, some of who are on this panel as well as in the audience, as well as others, reaching out to those who were part of the survey but don't necessarily have a voice in some of these fora. So bring them together to put together a strong industry voice. And of course, there'll be debates about what sectors should be in there, you know, which occupations. That's, you won't solve that on day one, but a common platform, what organization that looks like, who should lead it, all of that can be decided, but with the objective of bringing these folks together. A good parallel is Sri Lanka's IT industry. SLASCOM has done what no other industry has done in terms of the recognition that it's brought, the global partnerships that it's brought to itself, crafting their own national brand and getting it adopted by government, Island of Ingenuity, launching global campaigns themselves with government money, but not waiting for government money. And they have really reached out also, not just the large firms, not just the foreign-owned firms, but really reached out to startups as well. So one big recommendation would be that some of the things that you can then do is you can do some of the stuff at the macro level, which is try and take steps to address the big constraints that have been highlighted in this report. Raising capital has been a top #1 ranked constraint. Accessing raw materials has been identified as a top constraint. So when you work together as an industry group, however diverse and heterogeneous that industry is, you can begin to address these. On raising capital, for example, think of in 5 years from now, the industry group wants to launch a creative economy or creative industry bond and raise money through that because banks are not lending to you. You can do stuff like that. On accessing raw materials, industry working together to drive common procurement, to drive costs down and solve that challenge. As a group, you could also expand your reach through global partnerships, and it's much easier when it's as a group rather than individual companies. And overall, trying to do what you can as the private sector while you continue to advocate the government fix some of the constraints faced in your sector. And in the spirit of doing what you can do, I think just like other sectors, in this sector too, enterprises and entrepreneurs need to be competitive, need to improve their business, all of the things beyond the creativity part. So an industry body or a grouping, association, whatever you call it, can help individual enterprises and entrepreneurs do better on finance and capital, on business development, on marketing, on supply chain, on driving operational improvements, managerial competence, all of that which is internal to the firm, but also things like regulatory barriers, which different folks in the sector face, which is external to the firm. So overall, I think just coming together in a credible body where you may not have a perfect structure on day one, you may not have perfect representation on day one, you may not be able to advocate for every issue on day one, but build it up with some main goals in mind. For instance, we saw that as of 2014, the industry was valued at $800 million US. Put a goal. We want to be a $2 billion industry by 2025. Government will take you seriously because suddenly you're telling government, hey, this is an industry we didn't think about. And they're telling me that they can deliver $2 billion in exports. Fantastic. So put some targets and come together as an industry and really drive credibility and voice and prominence for this industry.
Thank you very much, Anush. I think all of us would agree with those comments, actually. And I know that by the time we came to the end of crafting, editing and producing the report, we're very much of the opinion that collaboration and cooperation among all of us, and I mean all of the sector, and the sort of people who've joined this webinar today, is going to be key in taking this forward. And I hope that all of you will stay in touch as we progress the recommendations and the ideas that have come in the report, but also in the conversation today. Now, very sadly, we are coming to the end of our time here. And so what I'd like to do is just really thank everyone who has contributed today. John, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your input. Dilanie, Annemarie, thank you. Linda, Selyna and Anush, we can't thank you enough for giving some of your time today and sharing your expertise, your thoughts. And thank you for very, what I would say, a very cared for and carefully thought contributions. I felt it was a very genuine discussion. There was a sense that everybody really cared, and we certainly do at the British Council. Before I end, I'd just like to thank the audience. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to thank the team at the British Council who put this together, and I welcome all of you in coming forward with us on this journey together. Before we close down, I have asked our organising host to try to leave the chat open for another 20 minutes or so. And if you want to continue to contribute, if you want to give feedback, we will do our best to capture that. And so although our faces will disappear from the screen and the panel will disappear at this point, I would just like to say that your thoughts and your comments as an audience are still very welcome. So thank you very much, and I think that's goodbye for the time being. Thank you.